In October of 1858, Daniel did something no enslaved man in Mississippi had ever survived doing. He stood still while his wife and 3 children were sold to 5 different buyers. No screams. No resistance. No collapse. Witnesses later said he smiled once, just once, as the auction hammer fell for the final time. The white society of Adams County was unsettled, but they believed the story ended there. By the following spring, 7 men would be dead, 2 plantations would be abandoned, and 1 child legally declared lost to God. What really happened after that auction? What did Daniel do that made slave traders burn their own ledgers and swear never to speak his name again? Before we uncover the disturbing truth behind Daniel's silence, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to the day his life was dismantled piece by piece. In October of 1858, the sky above Adams County hung low and colorless, like a lid pressed down by God himself. The air was thick with river damp and crushed leaves, carrying the smell of mud, horse sweat, and human fear. By mid-morning, the town square had already filled. White men in linen coats, women shaded by parasols, boys perched on barrels for a better view. At the center stood the auction block, a rough wooden platform scarred by decades of boots and bloodless transactions that ruined lives with the fall of a hammer. Daniel stood at the edge of it all. He did not fidget. He did not bow his head. His hands were folded loosely in front of him, wrists unchained for the moment, palms rough from years of shaping wood and iron. Anyone watching would have said he looked calm, resigned, perhaps even empty. They were wrong. To Daniel's left stood Ruth, his wife of 12 years. She held their youngest against her chest, rocking slightly, though the child had long since stopped crying. Her dress was patched so many times the original fabric was a rumor. Her eyes, once sharp and curious, now stared somewhere past the crowd, as if she were already learning how to leave her body behind. 3 children. All standing close. All close enough to touch. That was the cruelty of it. "Step forward," the auctioneer called, voice slick with practiced cheer. "Strong man first." Daniel moved when ordered. He climbed the steps and turned as instructed. Shoulders squared. Jaw set. He knew this routine. He had been sold once already in his life at 16, when his mother was traded to settle a debt and he was listed as extra stock. Prime age, 32. Skilled with tools. Cooper, carpenter, general labor. No recorded infractions. No recorded mercy either. The bids came quickly. Numbers tossed like stones. Daniel watched faces instead of hands. He memorized jawlines. Boots. Rings. He noted who leaned forward eagerly and who pretended not to care. What he did not do was look at Ruth. The hammer fell. Daniel was sold. They led him off the block and made him stand near the oak tree that had shaded 100 such days. He could still see the platform. Still hear the crowd. Next. Woman. 28. Healthy. Good breeding history. Ruth was guided forward. Her arm tightened around the child. Daniel felt something in his chest tear, not loudly, not all at once, but like cloth being ripped slowly, deliberately. The auctioneer lifted the baby from her arms and handed the child to a clerk. "Sold separate," he said casually. "Better price." Ruth made a sound then. Not a scream. Something worse. Something small and broken that never reached the crowd. Daniel did not move. The first child was sold to a planter heading north. The second to a widow who smelled of camphor and grief. The third, his eldest, Isaac, 10 years old, was examined like livestock. He checked. Hands pried open. Boy looked stubborn. Strong enough. Will grow into trouble. The hammer fell. 5 buyers. 5 destinations. No 2 within the same county. This was not unusual. That was the most terrible part. By the time the auctioneer wiped his brow and called for the next lot, Daniel's family no longer existed in any legal sense. The law had erased them in under an hour. Someone in the crowd laughed at a joke Daniel could not hear. A man near the front leaned toward another and muttered, "At least this one took it quiet." Daniel looked up then. Just once. He smiled. It was not wide. Not warm. It lasted no more than a breath. But 3 people saw it, and all 3 would later swear they wished they had not. They chained Daniel again before leading him away. Iron biting into skin. Familiar pain. The kind you learn to carry. As they marched him toward his new owner's wagon, Ruth turned her head at last. Their eyes met across the churned dirt and boots and broken footprints. "Daniel," she whispered. He stopped walking. The handler jerked the chain. "Keep moving." Daniel did not resist. He did not plead. He did not shout. He spoke quietly, calmly. "Remember the hymn?" he said. Ruth froze. The handler struck him across the back with a switch, sharp enough to draw breath from the lungs. Silence. Daniel stumbled forward, but his eyes never left Ruth's. "Sing it slow," he finished. Then he was pulled away. Ruth did not understand. Not yet. She would spend weeks turning those words over in her mind, whispering hymns at night until one of them began to sound wrong in a way she could not explain. By dusk, the square was empty. The platform stood alone, dark with shadow, waiting for the next market day. Daniel rode away in the back of a wagon, chains rattling with every turn of the wheel. The road led south, then east, away from everything he had built his life around. What the men riding beside him did not know was that Daniel had already begun counting. Steps, days, names. He had memorized the buyers' faces, the routes they discussed, the rivers they would cross. He had learned long ago that grief could be loud, or it could be useful. This was the last moment anyone would ever mistake his silence for surrender. None of them knew what October of 1858 would come to mean. Not yet. Daniel's usefulness had always been the reason he survived. The wagon rattled east through a corridor of cypress and low fog, wheels cutting ruts into red clay softened by recent rain. Chains clinked with each jolt, a dull, rhythmic sound that matched Daniel's breathing once he forced it to steady. Around him sat 3 other enslaved men, strangers bound by iron and silence. One whispered prayers under his breath. Another stared at his hands as if they no longer belonged to him. The third wept openly, shoulders shaking, tears streaking lines through the dust on his face. Daniel did none of these things. He watched the road. By nightfall they reached a small holding yard near the river, a place meant for bodies in transit. Lantern light revealed warped fencing, a lean-to for guards, and the slow black movement of water just beyond the trees. Mosquitoes whined. Somewhere a bullfrog croaked, steady and indifferent. "Sit," the guard said. They sat. Bread was thrown to them like feed. Daniel caught his without scrambling. He tore it carefully, chewing slowly, forcing his body to accept fuel. Hunger was a problem to be solved, not indulged. One of the men beside him glanced over. "You ain't said a word since morning." Daniel kept his eyes forward. "Nothing to say." "You got family?" the man pressed, voice low. Daniel did not answer. That too was learned. He had been born on a rice plantation along the South Carolina coast, a place where the air never dried and the days were measured by tides. His mother had taught him numbers by scratching marks into the dirt behind their cabin, teaching him to add and subtract with pebbles and patience. A white boy from the big house had once left a book behind, and Daniel, barely 12, had hidden it beneath loose floorboards and taught himself letters by moonlight. Knowledge was dangerous. He understood that early. But ignorance was fatal. By 16 he could read shipping manifests well enough to understand where people were sent and why. He learned which words meant never returning, which meant sold nearby, which meant temporary. When his mother was sold, the overseer told him it was God's will. Daniel had nodded. He had always nodded. Later, on a different plantation, he learned trades. Wood first, barrels that did not leak, joints that held. Then metal. Then the art of repairing what others broke. Masters liked men who fixed things quietly. Men who did not drink. Men who could be trusted to walk between buildings without an escort. Men who saw everything. When Daniel married Ruth, it was with permission and paperwork, a legal fiction that could be undone at any moment. She sang in the evenings, hymns learned from her grandmother, melodies that curled through the quarters like smoke. Daniel listened more than he sang. He learned the patterns in the songs, the repeated lines, the pauses that allowed breath. Those pauses mattered. In Mississippi, usefulness meant survival. It meant being loaned out, sent ahead, trusted with keys and wagons. It meant hearing conversations not meant for him. It also meant watching families disappear. The first time he saw children separated, he had nearly lost control. The second time, he had clenched his jaw until his teeth ached. By the third, he had learned to store the pain somewhere deep where it could not be seen. Ruth had noticed the change. "You go quiet after days like that," she had said once, sitting beside him on the cabin step. "Like you're counting something." "Just tired," he had answered. She had studied his face. "Be careful what you keep inside." He had wanted to tell her then. Wanted to say that quiet was not emptiness, that it was preparation. But some truths were too sharp to hand to someone you loved. Now, in the holding yard, Daniel lay back against the fence and stared at the stars. The sky here was wider than the one he had known, the constellations slightly shifted. He mapped them anyway the way he mapped everything. A guard walked past, boots crunching gravel. You, he said, pointing at Daniel. What you do? Daniel sat up. Work wood. Metal when needed. The guard nodded. New owner's got a mill. You behave, you'll stay busy. Daniel inclined his head. Yes, sir. The guard paused, looking at him more closely. You don't look like the others. What way is that? Like you're already somewhere else. Daniel met his gaze evenly. No, sir. I'm here. The guard snorted and moved on. What Daniel did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that Ruth, miles away, was already humming the hymn he had named. Slowly, carefully, lingering on the wrong notes, just as he had taught her years ago when the children slept and the night felt almost safe. By morning, the wagon would roll again. By week's end, Daniel would reach his new plantation. By month's end, his silence would have earned him a reputation. And beneath that reputation, beneath the bowed head and measured steps, something else would begin to take shape. Not rage. Design. Daniel saw the men again in pieces before he ever saw them whole. He recognized them by the residue they left behind. Names spoken by guards, routes mentioned in passing, the casual arithmetic of bodies and miles. The river trader went north first, boasting loudly about cotton prices and the speed of his keelboat. The widow's wagon creaked west, heavy with furniture and grief. The expansion planter turned south, already talking about clearing new land. The overseer lingered, drinking, arguing over a disputed receipt. And the last buyer, the one who took Isaac, said almost nothing at all. That silence marked him. Daniel learned their names without asking. Names floated in the air around men who believed themselves untouchable. He learned which ones drank before noon, which carried pistols even among friends, which trusted paper more than people. At his new plantation, work began before dawn. The mill groaned to life under his hands, belts tightened, gears coaxed into alignment. The owner, Mr. Hollis, watched from a distance at first, arms folded, suspicion carved into his posture. Can you fix it? Hollis asked the first day, nodding at a warped wheel. Yes, sir. How long? By sunset. Hollis scoffed. We'll see. By sunset, the mill turned smooth. Trust followed competence the way flies followed sugar. Daniel was allowed to move between buildings. Allowed to fetch tools from storage sheds. Allowed to work late when others were locked in. Allowed to listen. He heard about the trader first. A man named Pritchard. River routes. That's a habit of cutting corners on food to save costs. Daniel filed it away. He heard about the widow next. Mrs. Avery. 2 grown sons dead of fever. A plantation barely holding together. She had taken a child to fill a quiet house, not knowing quiet could scream. The expansion planter was a man called Baines. Young, ambitious, hungry for acreage. He talked openly about breaking wills the way one broke horses. The overseer, Clay, drank himself into anger most nights and blamed everyone but himself for the state of his life. And Isaac's buyer, Mr. Whitlow, owned land farther east. Pine country. Sparse soil. He attended church regularly and spoke softly of discipline. Daniel said nothing. He worked. At night, in the quarters, whispers circled. Men traded rumors like contraband. Someone had seen a boy matching Isaac's description on a wagon weeks earlier. Someone else swore Ruth had been sent upriver and would never be seen again. Daniel lay awake and counted breaths. 3 weeks passed. One morning, Hollis called him to the main house. You know barrels, he said. We're shipping grain downriver. I need them sound. Yes, sir. You'll ride with the load. Daniel felt the shift immediately. Movement meant information. Proximity. Chance. The river was brown and wide, carrying silt and secrets. As the boat pushed off, Daniel noted landmarks. He listened to conversations drift across the deck. Pritchard's name came up again, complaints about delayed shipments, missing payments. By the second night, the boat tied up near a bend choked with cypress knees. Lanterns flickered. The crew drank. Daniel worked on a leaking barrel near the stern when a voice behind him said, You. He turned. Pritchard stood there, squinting, a bottle in his hand. Older than Daniel had remembered. Sloppier. You from Adams County? Pritchard asked. Yes, sir. Thought I recognized you. Quiet one. Took it all real calm. Daniel inclined his head. Just doing as told. Pritchard laughed. That's the trick, ain't it? They talked longer than necessary. Pritchard boasted. Drank. Complained about buyers who paid late. About routes that weren't safe anymore. About how sometimes men just fell overboard and no one asked too many questions. Daniel listened. What Pritchard did not notice was how Daniel's hands never shook. How his eyes tracked every movement on deck. how he measured the distance to the rail without looking. Later, when the crew slept, Daniel stood alone at the stern and watched the water slide past. The river took what it was given. Always had. Miles away, Mrs. Avery sat in a darkened parlor, listening to a child cry in a voice that did not yet know how to ask for his mother. Farther still, Baines rode fence lines and spoke of expansion, never noticing how the land resisted him. And in a pine-shadowed yard east of everything Daniel had known, Isaac learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut, because Mr. Whitlow's kindness had edges. None of them knew the order in which their lives would begin to unravel. But Daniel did. He had already chosen the first thread to pull. By the time winter settled into the lowlands, Daniel's silence had become a feature of the plantation, remarked upon the way men remarked on whether they could not control. It was not the stunned quiet of grief, nor the sullen muteness of defiance. It was orderly, selective. He spoke when spoken to. He answered exactly what was asked. No more. Masters trusted what they could not provoke. Good worker, Hollis told a neighbor one afternoon, watching Daniel plane a warped beam smooth with patient strokes. Doesn't complain. Doesn't stir trouble. The neighbor squinted. He ever laugh? Can't recall it. That kind makes me nervous. Hollis waved it off. You worry too much. Daniel heard all of it. The plane whispered along the wood. Shavings curled away like pale ribbons and fell at his feet. He felt the grain through his hands, the subtle resistance that told him where a knot lay hidden. Would always told the truth if you listened. People did too. In the quarters, the others watched him carefully. Some pitied him. Some feared him. A few resented the way he moved through space now, unhurried, untouched by the small humiliations that consumed others. One night, as men shared a thin stew and colder rumors, a driver leaned close. You ain't right, the driver said. Lost your family and you don't howl about it. Makes folk uneasy. Daniel lifted his bowl and sipped. Noise brings eyes. The driver snorted. Silence don't save nobody. Daniel looked at him, then really looked. It saves time. That was all he said. He did not join in the morning songs when they rose at night. Instead, he listened from the edge, counting measures, noting which verses lingered and which were rushed. He paid attention to who sang and who did not, who faltered on certain lines, who carried grief like a wound that would never close. One evening, an older woman approached him while others slept. Her hair was white as cotton fluff, her back bent, her eyes sharp. You the man what lost everybody, she said. Daniel did not correct her. You know hymns, she went on. All of them, I reckon. Some. She nodded. Songs carry messages. Always have. Yes, ma'am. She studied him. You planning something? It was not a question. Daniel met her gaze. I am planning to keep breathing. She smiled then, slow and knowing. Breathing can be a long game. That night, Daniel dreamed for the first time since the auction. Not of Ruth's face or his children's voices, but of a ledger. Pages filled with names and numbers. He watched as the ink bled through, blurring the columns until the entries became meaningless. When he woke, the image stayed with him. Weeks later, Hollis sent him to the edge of the property to repair a collapsed fence. Daniel worked alone. Beyond the trees, a narrow road cut toward the river. He heard hoofbeats before he saw the rider, a man from a neighboring plantation, red-faced and impatient. Roads washed out, the rider complained. You seen anyone come through? Daniel straightened slowly. No, sir. The rider spat. Damn traders. Can't keep to schedule. Which traders, sir? The man glanced at him, surprised by the question. Pritchard. Owes me a delivery. Daniel nodded once. River's high. Everything's high, the rider muttered and kicked his horse forward. Daniel watched him go. By spring, small things began to happen. A shipment arrived late, barrels damp and mold-flecked. A mule slipped its harness and bolted at an inconvenient moment. A bridge plank snapped under a wagon's weight and had to be replaced at cost. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be traced. Daniel was often nearby. Never involved. Bad luck, men said. Rivers cursed this year. Must be God testing us. Daniel did not argue. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that Ruth had been sold again. Traded quietly to settle a dispute between two men who saw her only as a number. She traveled under a different name now, her past erased with a stroke of ink. At night, she still sang, slow and careful, altering the hymn just enough that a certain kind of listener would notice. And someone did notice. Back at Hollis's plantation, a clerk complained one evening about missing papers. Swear they were here, he said, tapping the desk. Receipts don't just walk away. Hollis frowned. Find them. Daniel stood in the doorway waiting for instructions that did not come. Later, alone in the tool shed, Daniel took out a small scrap of paper he had hidden beneath a loose board. On it were numbers, dates, names. Not many yet. Enough to begin. Silence, he had learned, was not the absence of sound. It was the space where things could be rearranged without anyone noticing. And by the time anyone thought to listen closely, the shape of that silence had already changed. The first movement did not look like defiance. It looked like obedience taken too far. By early April, Hollis had begun to rely on Daniel in ways that would have unsettled him if he had ever stopped to think about it. Keys were left on hooks. Instructions were given once instead of twice. Daniel was sent ahead with wagons to prepare loads, trusted to check counts and secure latches. Trust was a habit. Like any habit, it dulled the senses. Take this to the river landing, Hollis said one morning, handing Daniel a folded paper. Make sure it reaches Pritchard's men. Daniel unfolded it just enough to see the seal. A routine notice. Payment. Scheduling. Nothing unusual. Yes, sir. He walked the mile to the landing alone, boots sinking into damp soil. The river was swollen with spring melt, brown and restless. 2 flatboats were tied off, crews lounging and smoking. A young deckhand took the paper and squinted. Pritchard ain't here. When will he be? The deckhand shrugged. Supposed to meet us upriver. If he's late again, captain'll be fit to spit. Daniel nodded. I'll wait. He waited longer than necessary. Long enough to hear complaints. Long enough to learn that one barrel had been replaced at the last stop. Long enough to hear a whispered argument about weight discrepancies. When he returned to Hollis's place at dusk, Daniel reported exactly what he had been told. 2 days later, Pritchard's boat ran aground on a sandbar it had passed safely for years. The delay cost him a contract. No one connected it to the quiet man who had stood at the landing. The second movement was smaller. Daniel repaired a wheel and replaced a pin with one that looked identical but had been filed thin. It held until it didn't. A wagon collapsed on a back road, spilling grain into the mud. Damn thing was faulty, the owner swore. Daniel examined the wreckage later, expression neutral. Metal fatigues, he said. Happens. By the third movement, patterns began to form, though only in Daniel's mind. He kept them there, refining them, testing them. Like a tune hummed too softly for anyone else to hear. It was during this time that he learned where Isaac was. The information came from a source who did not know they were giving it. A driver drunk on cane liquor, boasting about how Whitlow ran his place cleaner than most. Boy works the yard, the driver said. Quiet one. Looks like he learned early. Daniel's hand tightened on his cup. Pine Country? East, the driver nodded. Past the old mill. Daniel let the conversation drift. That night he did not sleep. He mapped the route in his head. Counted days. Considered patrols. Considered Whitlow's reputation, the kind of man who liked order and believed kindness could be rationed. The fourth movement involved no objects at all. Only words. Daniel stood near the fence one evening as 2 men talked about Mrs. Avery. Woman's near broke, one said. Child cries night and day. Neighbors complaining. She shouldn't have bought one so young. Daniel spoke without turning. Children settle when they feel safe. The men stared. It was the longest sentence Daniel had spoken in weeks. One of them snorted. Ain't your concern. No, sir. But the words lodged where they landed. Weeks later, Mrs. Avery sent word upriver asking about selling the child. Quietly. By late spring, Daniel's list had grown. Still small. Still hidden. But no longer theoretical. What he did not know was that someone had begun watching him. Not closely, not yet, but with a flicker of curiosity that would later harden into suspicion. Clay, the overseer from Adams County, had heard rumors. Delays. Accidents. Traders complaining about bad luck that followed certain shipments. Funny thing, Clay said to a companion over drinks. All them stories trace back to the same places. Bad year, the companion replied. Clay shook his head. Maybe. Or maybe somebody's moving pieces. He did not yet have a name. Daniel felt the shift before it showed. A tightening in the air. A sense that time was narrowing. He began to move faster. One night, under a moon thin as a blade, Daniel slipped from the quarters and followed the road east. He did not run. He walked as if he belonged there, as if every step had been sanctioned. At a bend in the road, a wagon passed. He stepped aside, head bowed. Inside the wagon, unseen, a child clutched a blanket and hummed a hymn, slow and wrong in all the right places. Daniel waited until the sound faded. Then he turned back, heart steady, mind sharpened. The first movement had been made. The others would follow whether anyone noticed or not. Ruth learned the shape of the river by sound before she ever saw it. At night, when the others slept or pretended to, the water spoke through the walls, slapping against the hull of the flatboat, whispering against reeds, groaning when the current caught on something hidden. It was a voice that never tired. It reminded her of breathing, of how bodies insisted on living even when there was no kindness left in the world. They had renamed her. Not cruelly, not dramatically. Simply crossed out the name Ruth on a sheet of paper and wrote another in its place, as if the first had been an error. She answered to it because answering kept her fed, because refusing did nothing but shorten days. The plantation upriver was smaller than the one she had left, the house squat and weathered, the land worked hard and giving little in return. The owner, Mr. Dalrymple, liked order and believed himself gentle. He spoke softly. He quoted scripture. He never struck her himself. He did not have to. Ruth worked in the kitchen at first, then in the fields when another woman fell ill. Her hands cracked and bled. Her back learned new pains. At night, she lay on a pallet and stared into darkness so thick it felt solid. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a kind of currency, and she had nothing left to spend. Weeks passed. Then months. Seasons changed by the angle of the sun and the smell of the air. She marked time by hymns. Sang them quietly while she worked, careful not to draw notice. Most were the same as always, except one. She sang it slow, slower than it wanted to be sung. She lingered on the wrong notes, stretched certain words until they bent. She did not know why at first, only that when she sang it straight, her chest ached too sharply. When she altered it just a little, the ache eased. One evening, as she scrubbed pots by lantern light, an older man paused near the doorway. He was a driver, gray-bearded, eyes sharp despite his years. "That tune," he said. "You sing it odd." Ruth's hand stilled. "Just tired, sir." He watched her a moment longer than was comfortable. "My grandmother used to sing it that way." Ruth looked up. Where was she from? Mississippi. Her breath caught. The man scratched his beard. Said it meant something, sung like that. Never said what. Ruth returned to her work. Songs carry many meanings. He nodded slowly. Yes, they do. After that, small kindnesses appeared where none had been before. An extra heel of bread. A warning glance when the overseer was in a mood. Once, a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath her bowl. She did not open it until she was alone. On it was a single line written carefully. Sing it slow. Someone is listening. Ruth pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. Daniel had always believed in preparation, in counting, in patience. Ruth had believed in endurance, in surviving one day so you could face the next. She had never imagined those beliefs might meet in the same place. Weeks later, a new rumor moved through the quarters like a current. A trader had gone missing. Not dead officially, just gone. His boat found adrift. No body. No witnesses. Men whispered of curses. Of the river taking its due. Ruth listened. She noticed that certain names were no longer spoken aloud. That ledgers were checked twice. That Dalrymple's prayers grew longer and more frantic. One night, as she lay half awake, footsteps approached her pallet. A woman knelt beside her, breath warm against her ear. "You got family?" the woman whispered. Ruth hesitated. "Had." The woman nodded. "I know someone who knows someone. Says a man's been asking quiet questions. Careful questions." Ruth's heart hammered. "About who?" "About a woman sold upriver. Sings wrong." Ruth swallowed. "What kind of man?" "Kind that waits." That was enough. From then on, Ruth sang every night. Sometimes too softly to hear. Sometimes loud enough that the wrong people frowned. She sang in kitchens and fields and yards. She sang while scrubbing floors and hanging wash. She sang when she was told to be quiet. And every time she altered the hymn just enough. What she did not know, what Daniel did not know yet either, was that Isaac had begun humming the same tune miles away without remembering where he had learned it. In Pine Country, Whitlow noticed the boy's habit and frowned. "What's that noise?" Isaac shrugged. "Just a song." "Sing it right." Isaac tried. Could not. Something in him resisted. Back upriver, Dalrymple called Ruth into the house one afternoon. "I've had an offer," he said, folding his hands. "For you. Good price." Ruth felt the floor tilt. "Where?" "East. Better land." She bowed her head. "Yes, sir." Inside something steadied. Movement meant possibility. That night, as the wagon waited in the yard, the gray-bearded driver passed Ruth a bundle wrapped in cloth. "For the road," he said. Inside was bread and a small, crude carving of a star. "Follow it," he murmured. The wagon rolled out before dawn. Ruth did not look back. Above them, the river whispered, carrying songs downstream, threading them together where no one thought to listen. And somewhere, counting steps and days, Daniel felt the plan tighten, drawing its pieces closer. The song had been heard. The river was answering. By the time Ruth's wagon turned east, the work had already begun to arrange itself around Daniel like a pattern you only saw once it was nearly complete. He never called it a plan. Plans were things written down, things that could be stolen or confessed under pressure. What Daniel built had no name and no center. It moved the way water did, around obstacles, through cracks, patient enough to wait for weakness. The first rule was this: no one was to know what they were helping. He spoke to a cooper about barrel hoops that snapped too easily when overheated, to a ferryman about currents that shifted after storms, to a cook about which traders refused salt to save coin and paid for it later. Each conversation was ordinary. Each request sounded like curiosity. Each answer slid into place. "River runs faster near the bend after heavy rain," the ferryman said one evening, spitting into the water. "Looks calm, but it'll pull you if you ain't careful." Daniel nodded. Good to know. He never returned to that bend himself. Trust, when it came sideways. A tool left where it could be found. A gate left unlatched at the right hour. A word passed that sounded like nothing at all. In the quarters, men noticed that Daniel asked different questions now. Who handles the books? Who counts the heads at night? Who drinks before sundown? No one thought it strange. Men talked to pass the time. Talking did not change anything. Or so they believed. Clay came by Hollis's plantation in late May, riding slow, eyes scanning. He had lost weight since Daniel last saw him, his face drawn tight with suspicion. "Things been smooth here?" Clay asked, dismounting. "Yes, sir," Hollis replied. "Why wouldn't they be?" Clay's gaze slid to Daniel, who was stacking boards nearby. "He the same one from Adams County?" "Yes." Clay watched him a moment longer. "Quiet. So quiet men keep secrets." Daniel did not look up. Clay snorted. "Or they're empty." He left without pressing further, but the unease lingered. That night, Daniel made a small change. He stopped being everywhere. He let others take tasks he could have done better. He allowed mistakes that cost little but shifted attention. A missing nail here. A delayed repair there. Let them think him ordinary. Messages moved without paper. A hymn sung wrong in one place meant a door open somewhere else. A star carved into wood meant a route was safe. A barrel marked twice meant count again. No one who carried these signals knew the whole of them. Some thought it superstition. Some thought it luck. A few understood enough to be afraid. One evening, Daniel walked beyond the fields to where the road forked. He waited there, still as a fence post, until a wagon creaked into view. The driver reined in when he saw him. "You lost?" the man asked. "No, sir. Road ahead's rough." Daniel nodded. "So I've heard." The driver hesitated. "You waiting on someone?" Daniel shook his head. "Someone waiting on me." The wagon rolled on. 2 nights later, a patrol took the wrong road and spent hours circling back through swamp, cursing and tired. On that same night, a child was moved from one cabin to another without being seen. In Pine Country, Isaac learned to listen for patterns too. He learned which boards creaked, which men walked heavy, which hours were safest. When a stranger passed through the yard one afternoon, a man who glanced at him and then away again, Isaac felt something shift, like a memory trying to surface. The man did not speak to him. He did not need to. Back at Hollis's place, Daniel was summoned to the main house again. The clerk frowned over a ledger. "Numbers don't line up," he said. "We're short." Hollis scowled. "How?" The clerk rubbed his temple. "Can't say. It's like the paper's lying." Daniel stood by the door. "May I see it, sir?" Hollis hesitated, then handed it over. Daniel traced the columns with his finger. "This total includes damaged goods." They were counted. "They were replaced," Daniel said softly. "Twice." The clerk blinked. "That's not." Daniel closed the book. "Mistakes common." Hollis grunted. "Fix it." "Yes, sir." The ledger went back on the shelf. Later, when no one was looking, a single page loosened and slipped free, caught by a draft from the open window. It landed beneath the desk. Daniel retrieved it hours later and burned it in the cookhouse fire, watching the ink curl and vanish. What he did not know What no one knew yet was that Mrs. Avery's child had been moved again, passed to a cousin to avoid attention. The cousin lived closer to Pine Country. Threads drawing tight. By midsummer, men spoke of bad years and worse luck. Traders prayed louder. Planters checked locks twice. Some laughed it off. Others did not sleep. Daniel slept little. When he did, he dreamed of roads converging, of rivers meeting, of stars lining up in a sky that finally made sense. The network did not announce itself. It did not demand loyalty. It asked for nothing that could not be given without notice. And that was why it worked. Because by the time anyone realized something was wrong, they could no longer say where it had begun, or who, exactly, had set it in motion. The first death was so quiet that most men missed it. Pritchard's boat did not return when expected. That alone was not unusual. The river kept its own calendar, and traders learned to blame water for what they did not want to explain. It was only when the second week passed and then the third that questions began to surface. They found the boat snagged against a bank of fallen trees where the current bent hard and fast. One lantern still hung from its hook, blackened with soot. The cargo was mostly intact. No signs of struggle. No blood. No Pritchard. Man must have slipped, the sheriff said after a cursory look. Drunk, probably. Men nodded. They wanted it to be that simple. Daniel heard about it 2 days later while repairing a gate hinge. The news traveled on the breath of a boy sent to fetch water. Trader gone, the boy whispered. River took him. Daniel kept working. The hinge aligned. The pin slid home. Anyone see him last? Daniel asked as if idly curious. The boy shrugged. Some say he was talking to a man from Hollis's place. Daniel nodded. Many men passed through here. That night, Clay drank himself into a foul mood. He slammed his cup on the table. River don't just take men, he said. Not careful ones. A farmer snorted. You saying someone pushed him? Clay stared into his drink. I'm saying someone might have let the river finish a job. Laughter followed. Nervous. Short. Daniel stood near the wall, unseen. The truth, what would never be written, was simpler than rumor and more dangerous. Pritchard had leaned too far over the rail that night, drunk and boasting. He had trusted the calm water. He had not accounted for the bend Daniel had marked weeks earlier, where the current dipped and surged without warning. Daniel had said nothing, done nothing. He had only chosen when to wait. The river had done the rest. By morning, Daniel had already moved on. The second consequence came faster. Mrs. Avery's child fell ill during the long ride to her cousin's place. Fever, coughing, the kind of sickness that fed on exhaustion. The cousin, frightened and unprepared, sent for help. A neighbor offered to take the child temporarily. That neighbor lived closer to Pine Country. Isaac heard the wagon before he saw it. He stood in the yard, heart pounding, the wrong hymn humming in his throat. When the wagon stopped and the child was carried down, small, pale, eyes too old for his face, Isaac knew without knowing why that this mattered. What's your name? Isaac whispered later, crouched beside him. Thomas, the boy croaked. Isaac nodded. I'm Isaac. That was all. Back west, Clay's unease hardened. He rode out again, asking pointed questions. Any trouble? Any missing tools? Any strangers passed through? Daniel answered calmly, truthfully. He offered nothing extra. Clay's eyes lingered. You ever work the river? Sometimes. No currents. Yes, sir. Clay leaned closer. You hear about Pritchard? Yes, sir. What you think happened? Daniel met his gaze. Men fall. Clay searched his face for something. Fear, guilt, satisfaction. He found nothing. The overseer rode away angry. That night, Daniel took a longer route back to the quarters. He paused by the cookhouse fire and watched embers glow and fade. First blood, he thought, not with triumph, not with relief, but with assessment. The system had responded exactly as expected. It had closed ranks, offered a simple explanation, moved on. Good. He slept for a few hours before dawn. When he woke, he felt the plan tighten another notch. By the end of the week, a patrol took a wrong turn again. A ledger page went missing. A bridge plank cracked under weight it should have held. None of it traced back to Daniel. None of it needed to. In Pine Country, Whitlow noticed the new child and frowned. We don't need another mouth. The neighbor shrugged. Temporary. Whitlow watched Isaac and Thomas together, whispering, sharing crusts of bread. Something in the sight unsettled him. Keep them apart, he ordered later. Isaac obeyed when watched. At night, he slipped back to the other boy's side and hummed softly, the tune bending in familiar ways. Miles away, Ruth rode east again, sold once more, passing through places Daniel had already marked. At one stop, she glimpsed a star carved into a fence post and felt her knees nearly give way. He was near. Or someone like him was. Men began to whisper about curses again. About rivers that remembered. About bad years that followed bad deeds. Daniel listened to none of it. He was past superstition. What he had set in motion did not need belief to work. It needed only patience. The first man was gone. Others would follow, not all to death, not yet. Some would lose property. Some would lose sleep. Some would lose the careful order they believed protected them. And one, soon, would lose a child he thought he owned. That would change things. Daniel rose before dawn, hands steady, mind already moving ahead. First blood had been spilled without a blade. The next step would not be so clean. The work changed once children were involved. Up to that point, Daniel's movements had been measured, almost abstract. Weights and currents, paper and distance. Children brought sound into the equation. Breath. Small mistakes that echoed. They also brought urgency, the kind that threatened patience if left unchecked. He adjusted. The first visit came at dusk, when the air lay heavy and the fields exhaled heat they had stored all day. Daniel was sent with a wagon to deliver repaired tools to a neighboring place. It was ordinary enough to pass without notice. He drove slow, reins loose, posture obedient. Near the edge of pine country, he stopped where the road dipped and the trees closed in. He waited until the cicadas rose, loud enough to cover the whisper of footsteps. A man stepped from the trees. Not tall. Not young. A face Daniel had seen only once, months earlier, in passing. Evening, the man said. Evening. You're late. Road soft. The man nodded and slipped a small bundle into the wagon bed, wrapped cloth, lightweight. Which one? Daniel asked. Thomas. Daniel closed his eyes for half a breath. Alive. Yes. Then move him again by morning. The man hesitated. Patrol's close. Then make them look the other way. The man studied Daniel. You're asking much. I am asking what is possible. That seemed to satisfy him. He melted back into the trees. Daniel did not look at the bundle until he was alone. Inside, Thomas slept fitfully, cheeks flushed, breath shallow. Daniel adjusted the cloth to keep him warm and turned the wagon back the way he had come. At the next farm, he left Thomas with a woman who did not ask questions. She took the child and nodded once. 2 nights, she said. No more. That will do. Isaac was harder. Whitlow's place ran on rules and routine. Gates locked at dusk. Dogs chained but alert. Order mistaken for safety. Daniel walked the perimeter on a later night, counting steps between posts, noting where the ground dipped and where the fence wire had been repaired too often to hold. He waited for a rainstorm. On the night it came, he moved with it, keeping to the shadows, the sound of water masking everything else. He reached the yard and tapped once, twice, then paused. Isaac appeared at the window, eyes wide. Do not speak, Daniel whispered. Get your shoes. Isaac did not ask who he was. He did not ask why. He moved as if he had been waiting for this exact instruction. They slipped out through the weak section of fence and did not stop until the dog's barking faded into rain. At a dry place beneath pines, Daniel knelt in front of the boy. Listen, he said. You will walk until your legs ache. You will not run unless I say. If anyone asks, you say you got lost. Isaac nodded. Where's Mama? Daniel swallowed. We are getting there. That was the truth and also not. They moved before dawn. By mid-morning, Isaac was hidden with a family who would take him farther east before nightfall. Daniel watched him go, memorizing the slope of his shoulders, the set of his jaw. He did not touch him. Touching lingered. The third child did not want to be found. She had learned to disappear long before Daniel reached her. She hid when footsteps came. She did not speak unless forced. When Daniel finally stood before her, she stared through him as if he were a shadow. Your name? He said gently. She did not answer. He waited. Minutes passed. The world held its breath. Your mother sings, he said finally. Slow. Something flickered. The girl's lips moved. She sings wrong. Daniel nodded. So do you. That night, the girl followed him without another word. It was the last of the children he would reach. One had been moved too often, too carelessly, and had slipped through hands Daniel could not follow without exposure. That loss sat heavy, a weight he did not set down. What he did not know yet was that Ruth had been sold again, closer now but not close enough. That she had heard of children being taken in the night and had prayed not to know whether that was mercy or something worse. The reunions, when they came, were brief and dangerous. No embraces. No weeping. Words rationed. Eat, Daniel said to Thomas. Sleep, he told Isaac. Stay quiet, he told the girl. They did as told. By the end of the month, rumors hardened. A child missing here. Another moved without record there. Clay wrote again, anger sharpening his questions. People talk, he said to Hollis. Say someone's stealing property. Hollis scoffed. Nonsense. Clay's gaze slid inevitably to Daniel. You hear anything? Clay asked. Daniel shook his head. No, sir. Clay stared at him longer than before. If I find out you're lying? Daniel met his eyes. You will find out many things, sir. Clay recoiled as if struck, then laughed harshly. You got a mouth on you now. Only when spoken to. Clay rode away unsettled. That night, Daniel sat alone and reviewed what had been done. 2 children moved to safety. 1 hidden beyond reach. 1 lost. Not enough. The plan had always assumed loss. It accounted for it. But accounting did not lessen the ache. He stood and looked toward the east, where Ruth was somewhere beyond the horizon. Somewhere closer than before. The network tightened. Routes shortened. Risks increased. Children had been touched by the plan now. That meant the end was approaching. Because the system could forgive accidents. It could absorb losses. But it did not tolerate theft. And Daniel was about to take something it believed it owned completely. Exposure did not arrive with trumpets or warrants. It crept in on habits. Clay began riding without announcing himself. He showed up at dawn and lingered past supper. He asked the same questions in different orders, watching faces instead of listening to answers. He took notes he pretended were for his own memory and then compared them to ledgers that suddenly felt unreliable in his hands. What moved last week? He asked Hollis one morning. Grain. How much? Hollis frowned. Same as usual. Clay's pencil hovered. Usual changes. Daniel stood by the window measuring a board. He did not look at Clay. He did not need to. The air told him everything. Clay rode east that afternoon and did not come back until nightfall. When he returned, his boots were muddy in a way that suggested he had left the road. He drank in silence and left before dawn. By midweek, a patrol took a child from a cabin 2 miles away and returned him before anyone noticed he was gone. It was a test. The child said nothing useful. The patrol left angry and embarrassed. Clay's suspicion sharpened. He came again alone this time. You ever think about running? He asked Daniel casually as if asking about the weather. No, sir. Why not? Daniel set the board down. Too many directions. Clay smiled thinly. That's the first honest thing you've said. Daniel met his gaze. I have not lied. Clay laughed then stopped. Funny thing about lies. Sometimes they're just truths out of order. He leaned closer. People say you're everywhere and nowhere. That you hear things before they happen. Daniel shrugged. People say many things. Clay watched him for a long moment, then turned away. If you're doing something, he said over his shoulder, I'll find it. Daniel waited until he was gone before breathing out. The network adjusted immediately. Routes shifted. Messages slowed. No child moved for 2 nights. Silence thickened, not empty now but loaded. In Pine Country, Whitlow discovered Isaac's absence at dawn. He swore, cursed the dogs, accused everyone. He sent riders out in all directions and promised punishment to anyone who knew more than they admitted. Isaac was already gone, carried farther east by hands that did not know his name. Whitlow rode to Clay by evening, rage spilling over. You said this place was secure. Clay's jaw tightened. Nothing's secure. Find the boy. Clay nodded. I'll find whoever took him. By the next day, 2 plantations had locked down. Head counts doubled. Songs were banned at night. A driver was whipped for humming while he worked. Daniel felt the constriction like a rope pulling tight. He made a choice. That night, he allowed himself to be seen. He walked openly to the far fence with a sack of tools and took longer than necessary repairing a post that did not need it. He spoke to a man he rarely addressed. He stood where moonlight caught him full in the face. Clay watched from a distance and nodded to himself. The following morning, Daniel was summoned to the main house. Clay waited there, hat on the table, ledger open. Sit, Clay said. Daniel sat. Clay tapped the ledger. Missing entries. Daniel looked at the page. Accounting error. Repeated. Yes, sir. Clay leaned back. You think I'm stupid? No, sir. Good, Clay said. Because I think you're clever. Daniel said nothing. Clay's voice dropped. You've been moving children. Daniel raised his eyes. That is an accusation. It's a fact, Clay snapped. One traitor gone. One boy vanished. Another passed around like bad coin. Songs changing. Routes shifting. And you standing in the middle of it like a stone. Daniel breathed evenly. You have no proof. Clay smiled. Not yet. They stared at each other. Time stretched. What you doing this for? Clay asked finally. Freedom? Daniel shook his head. Family. Clay laughed, harsh and disbelieving. Family's gone. Daniel's voice stayed level. So you think? Clay stood abruptly. You'll be watched. I always am. Clay paused at the door. You ever hear of men erased? He asked. Names scratched out. Stories buried? Daniel met his gaze. I have. Clay's expression hardened. That's what happens to men who think they can rearrange things. After he left, Hollis came in pale. What did you do? Daniel stood. My work. Hollis swallowed. Keep your head down. Daniel inclined it. That night, the network moved one last time before the trap could close. Ruth's wagon crossed a familiar road and did not stop where it was supposed to. A driver took a turn he had never taken before. A patrol arrived too late and blamed the dark. By morning, Clay had warrants he could not serve and suspicions he could not prove. He rode hard, furious, blind to how many of his men had begun to hesitate when ordered. They had seen too much go wrong. Daniel sat alone before dawn, considering the final step. It was the most dangerous, the most visible. It would leave no room for denial. Exposure had narrowed the world to a single point. All paths led there now, whether Clay liked it or not. Daniel rose and stepped into the thinning night. The next act would not be subtle. It would be impossible to ignore. The night Daniel chose was wrong for everything sensible. No moon. Low cloud. Wind just strong enough to pull sound apart and carry it elsewhere. It was the sort of night men stayed close to lamplight and told themselves the dark held nothing new. Daniel stepped into it with empty hands and a mind that had already crossed the distance twice. He moved east, then south, then east again, paths layered over paths, a map only he could read. The network had gone still behind him. No signals. No hymns bent out of shape. This part could not be shared. It could only be done. By the time he reached the road that led to Dalrymple's place, dawn was still a promise rather than a threat. The yard lay quiet. A single lantern burned in the kitchen window. Horses shifted in their stalls, leather creaking. Ruth's wagon stood near the shed, the boards fresh with mud from the wrong turn taken hours earlier. Daniel did not hurry. He tapped once, twice, then waited. The kitchen door opened a hand's width. A face appeared, gray-bearded, familiar. You're late, the driver whispered. So are they, Daniel said. Ruth emerged from the shadows, thinner than memory, eyes deeper, posture schooled into caution. For a moment neither of them moved. The years between them pressed close. You're real, she breathed. Yes. The driver cleared his throat. Patrol's an hour out. Maybe less. Daniel nodded. Then we don't have an hour. He did not touch Ruth. He handed her a folded cloth. Inside was bread and a small carving of a star. Follow, he said. If you hear water, stop. She did not ask where they were going. She had learned that questions came later, when survival had already been secured. They crossed the yard and slipped into the trees. Daniel led them along a line where the ground dipped and rose, where footprints confused themselves. Twice Ruth stumbled. Twice Daniel steadied her by the elbow, brief contact, gone. At the edge of pine country the road narrowed. The wind shifted. Daniel halted. Listen, he said. Far off hooves. A patrol riding hard. Off the road, Daniel murmured. They moved just as the riders burst past, lanterns swinging, curses sharp in the air. The sound tore by and thinned. When it was gone, Daniel waited until his breath matched the night again. They moved on. At the place where the pines opened into scrub, 3 figures stepped forward. Isaac first, jaw set, eyes older than they should have been. Thomas clinging to a woman's skirt. The girl standing apart, watchful. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. No sound came out. Daniel watched the moment settle. He allowed himself that much. Then he spoke. We go now. They moved as one body, a shape that did not exist on any ledger. At the creek, Daniel stopped and cut the bindings on a small raft hidden beneath brush. He pushed it into the water and steadied it while the children climbed aboard. Ruth followed, skirts gathered, hands shaking once before stilling. Hold fast, Daniel said. They drifted into the dark. Halfway across, a lantern flared on the bank behind them. Hey, a voice shouted. You there. The raft slid, current pulling. Daniel leaned into it, pushing with measured force. The water took them just enough. A shot cracked. The bullet slapped water where they had been a moment before. Ruth clutched Thomas. Isaac stared, unblinking. They reached the far bank and vanished into reeds. Daniel pulled the raft free and sank it where it would be found too late to matter. They walked until the land rose and the trees thinned. Dawn bled into the sky, pale and accusing. At the old mill, abandoned, half-collapsed, they stopped. Daniel barred the door and listened. No pursuit yet. The mill smelled of rot and iron. Sunlight lanced through broken boards. Ruth turned to him fully then. How? Daniel shook his head. Later. Isaac spoke. They'll come. Yes, Daniel said. But not here. He took a breath and made the final choice. He stepped back outside and walked toward the road, alone. By noon, Clay found him. They stood facing each other in open ground, the mill behind Daniel, the patrol spread thin. Where are they? Clay demanded. Daniel met his gaze. You are too late. Clay's face twisted. You think you won? I think you cannot explain what you have lost. Clay drew his pistol, then hesitated. Men watched. The mill watched. The morning watched. Search, Clay snapped. They found nothing. No children. No woman. No proof that what Clay knew had happened could be proven at all. By nightfall, word spread faster than truth ever did. A family seen together after the auction. A raft on the creek. A man who walked away smiling as if the law had failed to recognize him. Clay wrote reports. They contradicted each other. Names were scratched out. Pages torn free. In the weeks that followed, the system did what it always did when confronted with something it could not contain. It erased. Daniel's name disappeared from ledgers. The trader's loss was blamed on drink. The children were marked removed or deceased. Ruth's name reverted, then vanished. Years later, men would argue about what had really happened. Some would say it was impossible. Others would swear they saw it with their own eyes and then deny it again in the same breath. As for Daniel, some said he ran. Some said he died. Some said he never existed. The truth was simpler and more troubling. He had taken what the system claimed as property and made it uncountable. And that was something it could never forgive or undo. The aftermath arrived disguised as order. Within weeks, ledgers were corrected. Names aligned. Columns balanced. Men convinced themselves that the unease gnawing at them came from bad weather, poor harvests, unlucky timing. The system breathed in and out and pretended it had never been interrupted. Clay filed 3 reports. He burned 2. The remaining one was edited until it said nothing at all. A trader missing, presumed drowned. Children relocated due to illness. An enslaved man transferred, then unaccounted for. Unaccounted for was the closest the law ever came to admitting defeat. Hollis sold his mill by summer. He told neighbors he was tired of river business, tired of unpredictability. He never said that he had begun waking at night, convinced someone was counting his steps. He moved inland and avoided water thereafter. Mrs. Avery died quietly the following winter. Her house was sold. The parlor remained unused. Whitlow fenced his land higher and sang louder in church. He punished Isaac's absence by punishing those who remained. It did not bring the boy back. It did not bring him peace. Clay lasted another year. He grew thin. He drank less. He listened too closely. When promoted, he declined. When pressed for answers, he offered paperwork instead of certainty. His superiors eventually stopped asking. Men who could not explain things were liabilities. The mill collapsed in a storm 2 years later. No one rebuilt it. As for Ruth and the children, they moved the way smoke does, present only where no one thought to look for them. They stayed in one place just long enough to rest, then moved again. Names changed. Stories shortened. Faces aged into something safer. Ruth sang less. When she did, she sang straight. The hymns no longer needed bending. Daniel did not stay with them long. That was the hardest part. He understood that safety lay in distance, that his presence sharpened danger rather than easing it. One morning, he packed his few things and stood at the edge of the trees. You coming back? Isaac asked. Daniel knelt and met his eyes. No. Isaac swallowed. Why not? Because the world will look for me where you are. Ruth stepped forward then. She did not argue. She did not beg. She touched his hand once, firmly. You did enough, she said. Daniel nodded. You did more. He left before dawn, moving toward no destination that could be named. Years passed. Stories softened with retelling. What had been whispered as fact became rumor, then folklore. Some said a man had walked through fire without burning. Others said the river had risen up and carried children away like mercy. A few insisted it was all coincidence layered until it looked like intention. Historians would later argue over gaps in records from that region in 1858 and 1859. Missing names. Contradictory totals. A trader whose route ended abruptly. A plantation that changed hands too quickly. They would write papers. They would footnote speculation. None of them would find Daniel. Because erasure, once complete, is a kind of freedom. And because some acts are designed not to be remembered clearly, only felt. Even decades later, men avoided certain river bends without knowing why. Children learned songs that felt older than the words. Families moved east and west along paths that made no sense on a map but felt right underfoot. The system endured. It always did. But it endured with a scar it never explained. Daniel did not break the world. He did something far more dangerous. He rearranged it, quietly, precisely, until it could no longer pretend it had not been changed. And somewhere, long after his name had vanished from ink and memory alike, a man stood by a river and listened to water move where it pleased. That was enough. What do you think really happened here? Was Daniel a man, a movement, or a story people told themselves because the truth was too frightening to accept? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more dark historical mysteries that blur the line between documented history and buried horror, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this video with someone who believes history only belongs to the powerful. These stories need to be remembered. These voices need to be heard. I'll see you in the next one.